So research methods, the scientific process. This is for AS level Year 1 psychology. So what do you need to know for Year 1 psychology within the scientific process section of research methods? So we need to know aims, hypotheses, variables, both the different types of variables and how we can control them, sampling techniques, peer review, pilot studies, and how psychological research can impact on the economy. Aims, hypotheses and variables. All studies have an aim, and the aim is the purpose behind the study. By writing an aim down, it helps the research become more focused, and it clarifies what the researcher is trying to find out from the study. Hypotheses. So a hypothesis is a testable statement about the expected outcome. So it is a prediction, and it needs to be precise, and the variables need to be operationalised. We'll go into that in a bit more detail later on. Now, there are different types of hypotheses, so it's important that you know the differences between them, because you could be asked to write a specific hypothesis within the exam. A directional hypothesis is when the researcher has a generally good idea about what the outcome is going to be, so they're able to predict a specific outcome. So they'll say what the direction, any differences will be between the variables. Whereas a non-directional hypothesis is where they're not sure what the outcome will be. So they're saying there's going to be a difference, but not in which direction that will be. So why would we write a non-directional hypothesis, and why would you write a directional hypothesis? Now, if there's been previous research within a certain topic and it seems to suggest there is a trend or pattern, and that allows us to write a directional hypothesis, because we can look at the trend and say that this will lead to this. However, if there's been no previous research, or previous research has been inconclusive, then we have to write a non-directional hypothesis. So, for example, a non-directional hypothesis will be that caffeine will affect memory. We're not saying how it will affect memory. Okay, a directional hypothesis will be participants who consumed caffeine will score better on the memory test. Okay, so we're saying how that difference will be influenced. A null hypothesis. Okay, so we need to write a null hypothesis in order for the scientific process to be complete. So this is when we say there will be no effect on the dependent variable as a result of the independent variable. So there will be no influence of caffeine on memory. Okay, because we have to accept a hypothesis at the end, we have to make sure that we have a null hypothesis to accept in case our experimental or alternative hypothesis has to be rejected. So an experimental hypothesis is saying that the independent variable will have an effect on the dependent variable. We use an experimental hypothesis when we have conducted an experimental method. If it is a non-experimental method, it will be referred to as an alternative hypothesis. So the variables then. A variable is anything that can change or vary within a study. So the independent variable is the one that is manipulated or changed by the experimenter or researcher. The dependent variable is a variable that is measured, the one that we are measuring as a result of the manipulation. We need to make sure that we operationalize our variables. So we need to be very specific about how we are measuring each variable. So if I go back to my hypothesis where I said caffeine will affect memory, I haven't operationalized my independent variable, which is caffeine, and my dependent variable, which is memory. I need to say how I'm going to measure or manipulate them. So it could be that caffeine administered in a 100 milligram dose. So I've been very specific about how I am manipulating the caffeine levels. Will have an effect on number of words recalled in a memory test. So I've said how I'm going to measure memory. So it's very important that during an exam, if you are asked to write a hypothesis, that you operationalize those variables. An extraneous variable is anything other than the independent variable that could influence the dependent variable. And we need to make sure that we try and control those extraneous variables. If we fail to control an extraneous variable, they could affect the results and then they become a confounding variable, so they have confused the results. So if I was measuring the effects of caffeine on memory, but my participants did it in different rooms and the lighting levels were different, I have failed to control any extraneous variables. So how can we control our variables? So the demand characteristics then are the cues within the research that allows a participant to guess the aims, and they may cause the participants to change their behaviour. Either you will get a helpful participant who goes, I think I know what the researcher is trying to find out. I would try to make sure my results go in line with what they're trying to find out. You may get a participant that won't be helpful and will try and hinder you from finding it out. Either way, it will influence the findings and the conclusions that can be drawn. It will reduce the validity, so you're not actually measuring what you intend to measure. Investigator effects, so that's any behaviour resulting from the investigator or the researcher, so they can be conscious or unconscious. So it could be the design of the study, the selection of participants, and the interaction with participants. So how can we control these? We need to use randomisation. So if we are having different conditions, we need to randomly allocate the participants to those conditions. So if we had independent groups design, randomly allocating, say, one half of them to condition A and one half of them to condition B. Also, if we were looking at a word list, we need to randomly put them in order. Standardisation, so everything must be kept exactly the same for each participant. They must have the same instructions, the same procedure, the same word list, the same room, the same conditions, the same researcher. Also, the use of single blind and double blind studies can help control variables. So the single blind is when the researchers do not tell the participants if they are in the test condition or the control condition. So that should reduce any demand characteristics, so they don't behave in a way that they think they should. Double blind is when both the participants and the researcher do not know what condition the participants are in. So again, that should reduce any investigator effects as well as any demand characteristics. Another way that we can control variables is counterbalancing, and this is generally when we have used a repeated measures design. So counterbalancing is when we try to balance the order that the participants take part in the conditions. So half of the participants do condition A first, followed by condition B, whereas the other half will do condition B, followed by condition A. The reason why we do this is to try and reduce any fatigue or practice effects. So fatigue effects are when you've already done a similar task and you perform worse on the next task because you've become tired. Practice effects is where you've already done a similar task, therefore you perform better on the next task because you've done the similar task. So sampling techniques, you need to be aware about the 4 different types of sampling techniques, as well as the strengths and weaknesses of carrying out each one, because you may be asked to justify a reason why you have selected a certain sampling technique, or you may be asked to simply outline a sampling technique, or you may be asked simply to evaluate a sampling technique. So random sampling is when every person within the target population has an equal chance of being selected. So first, the researcher must obtain a list of everyone within the target population, and then they may use a computerized random name generator to generate their list of names, their sample, or they could use the names in the hat technique. So they put everyone's name in the hat and pull out a certain number. So because everyone has an equal chance of being selected, the chances of you creating a biased sample are relatively slim. So therefore, the population validity should be improved. However, it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to obtain the entire target population. So also, if you pull out a name, they might not be willing to take part anyway. Also, there is still a chance that you could get a bias sample. So it could be that some subgroups are overrepresented within your sample, or some aren't even selected. Opportunity sample. The researcher selects anyone who is available or willing to take part. So they simply ask the people that are most convenient to them. So it could be a researcher who works at a university, may ask the students within their lecture group or their seminar group to take part. So the strength of this is relatively time efficient, so therefore it costs less in comparison to other techniques. And as a result, the sample size might be larger. When we evaluate in terms of this, we need to make sure we compare it to. So we have to say that it is more time efficient than systematic sampling. However, samples are likely to be skewed in terms of the participants' background. So they tend to be all from the same sort of social group, geographical group, so they're not representative. So they may lack population validity, and therefore the findings may not be applicable to the target population. Volunteer sample is when the participants put themselves forward to take part. They are self-selecting. So it could be the researcher puts an advert in a newspaper or on the radio, or it could be putting a notice or a poster on a notice board for people to take part in the research. They might also put questionnaires within places such as magazines, newspapers, and ask people to return their answers. So again, this is quite an easy method of selecting participants. Also, it can be the only way of locating a niche group of participants if they're difficult to identify. However, only a certain type of people will volunteer, i.e. they could be the most cooperative, the most motivated participants, or they have a particular interest within that research area. Therefore, this reduces population validity once again, and it may be having difficulty generalising those findings. Systematic sampling is the sample made of participants chosen mathematically. So the researcher selects every nth person. So it could be the every fifth person in a row, or every 10th person. So if they have a sampling frame of 1,000 students, the researcher wanted 500 students, they would select every 20th person. It avoids bias, as the researcher has chosen what number they are going to use to select them, so they have no control over who's selected. However, it's not as objective as random sampling, as the researcher may decide how the people are listed before the selection and on what number to use during that system. Stratified. Okay, this is when the sample is made up of participants who reflect the whole target population. So the sample is divided into groups, and the participants are chosen from each group in the same proportions that they are represented in the target population. So for example, if we had a company and we knew that 60% of them were male and 40% of them were female, if I took a sample of 10, I would have to make sure that 6 of them are male, because that's 60% of 10, and 4 of them were female, because that's 40% of 10. So I'd have to make sure that I have the same representation of people within the target population. So as a result, the sample should be highly representative to the target population, and therefore we should be confident in generalising our results. However, it is the most time-consuming and difficult method of sampling in comparison to the other techniques. So pilot studies and peer review. A pilot study is a small-scale version, so a trial run of the research before it takes place. The aim is to check that all procedures, material, measuring scales, the standardised instructions work, or that they are accurate in generating results. If I find that they don't work for any reason, I would have to review and modify my design, test it again, and then if I'm satisfied with those results, move on to the real experiment. A peer review is the use of using independent experts to assess the quality and validity of research. So once I've carried out my investigation, I then have to write it up as a report for it to be submitted to a journal. So the article needs to be assessed for the quality of the results. So I've sent it off to an academic journal, and the editor receives the copy of my article. It then gets sent to different experts within the field, so my peers, in order for them to assess it. So it can be single blind, so the author of the journal is unaware of who is reviewing the journal. It could be double blind, so neither the author or the reviewers know who each other are. Or it could be an open review where everyone knows who everyone is. So the author is aware of who is judging their work, and the reviewees are aware of who the author is. Once they've read through the paper, they check it carefully to make sure there are no mistakes, there's no fraudulent data, there's no incorrect data within there, and they write a report with suggestions and comments. Based on that, the editor decides what to do with the article. So either they can accept it and it's published. They might accept it but say that some changes need to be made in order for it to be published. Or they could reject the article. So the purpose of it is to allocate research funding. So mostly research is funded by public bodies, so that is government and charitable bodies. And peer reviews allow them to decide which research is worthwhile for them to fund. It also stops faulty or incorrect data entering the public domain, because once it's entered the public domain, it's very hard to counteract that. And it also allows the university departments to reach a rating for their research. So all university departments, if they are scientific, have to carry out research, and it needs to be assessed in terms of quality. So future funding for the department depends on them receiving good ratings from the peer review. So evaluation, it's a strength of the peer review is that it prevents faulty or inaccurate information reaching the public domain, so which could influence how the public see or view psychology. However, some argue that it's an unachievable ideal, so it isn't always possible to find an expert within the field to research and review the article. Sometimes there is competition between the author and the people reviewing the article, so therefore it might not be as objective as one hoped. It could be some subjective issues surrounding the review. There is publication bias, so peer reviews tend to prefer articles that show a positive result. Also, ones that preserve the status quo. So peer reviews tend to prefer results that support previous theories rather than going against it. So that may impact on what research gets published. Finally, psychology and the economy. So attachment. Bowlby's theory and related research into attachment opened the eyes of the world to the importance of emotional care on a child development. So before Bowlby, people thought that as long as the physical needs of a child were met, then that was all that was important. So Bowlby's research has influenced UNICEF in the development of policies to ensure that a healthy development of children is important. So if we have healthy development of children, they'll become productive members of society. Attachment research has also impacted on daycare and childcare practices, for example the introduction of key workers and low staff to child ratios, which will help improve their development and educational development, which again will help them to become productive members of society, improving the world economy. We could talk about mental health. So absence from work costs the economy an estimated £15 billion a year. And most of these, or a third of these, are down to moderate health disorders. So therefore, if we can research the causes and treatments for these mental illnesses, then we should be able to help sufferers manage to their condition and return to work and contribute to the economy. We could also talk about the use of research into memory, and in particular eyewitness testimony, and how they've impacted on the police force. So if we are able to generate more detailed eyewitness testimonies, it may be beneficial because we could catch the criminal quicker, which would reduce the amount of time that we have spent on gathering details.